Hello, I am Eric Schumacher Rasmussen. I'm the editor-in-chief and VP of Streaming Media. Welcome to the fourth panel of the fourth day of the seventh Streaming Media Connect. As I said, 7 virtual events we've had since we all made the pivot in early 2020. We're going to be back in person, though, in May 24th and 25th at Streaming Media East in Boston. Registration's open at streamingmedia.com/east, and the program will go online tomorrow. We'll also be having the Content Delivery Summit on Monday, May 23rd. That will include at least a partially hybrid event, and our Streaming Media University workshops also on Monday, May 23rd. So take a look at that. Hope you can join us in Boston. But it's been a great virtual week here again. We're coming to the close. Wrap things up tomorrow with a workshop called The Best Streaming Gear and How to Use It. So if you like playing with toys, that's the one for you. Be sure to check it out. All of these sessions are available or will be available on demand soon after we wrap things up this week. But thank you for being here live. If you're here now, you're entered into a drawing to win an Amazon gift card. We'll pick a name at random, and I'll announce the name at the end of our hour. I'd also like to thank our diamond sponsors, Bird Dog and Harmonic, who've been with us for the entire week. And we've got a couple of brief video messages from them now. And I would like to thank Signiant for sponsoring this panel, and Signiant's Bill Thompson will be joining us in just a moment. A couple of housekeeping notes. Please put your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom window rather than in the chat. It's just easier for the moderator and I to keep track of questions if they come in there. Also, live transcripts are turned on for this presentation. If you're seeing the transcripts on your screen and you don't want to see them, go to the bottom of the Zoom window, click on Live Transcript, and select Disable Transcript. So let's start things off. We're going to be talking about cloud versus on-prem versus hybrid workflows from production to distribution. So moderating that discussion will be Tim Siglin, longtime streaming media contributing editor, longtime industry veteran. And for the last couple of years, you've been focusing on the Help Me Stream Research Foundation. And I want to spend just a couple of seconds talking about that, because what Help Me Stream is doing is really worth paying attention to. I'm actually involved in the organization as well. And Tim, tell everyone what Help Me Stream does and how they can help.
Sure, absolutely. So there are sort of 2 areas we work in. One is things like surveys that we do in streaming media, where we get a finger on the pulse of the industry, as well as market validation. So for instance, Wowza came to us when they got ready to launch their at-scale WebRTC, and we worked through with them market validation of that. But really the big goal that we have is we're collecting old technology. And when I say old technology, Eric shipped me a couple 2008 Mac Minis. I've got stuff that probably the newest we have is 2015, 2016 or so. But we collect old smartphones, tablets, laptops, desktops, network access gear. And then we take those things apart, put them into plexiglass boxes, stick them outside for 6 months to see how they function in a harsh environment, so that we can build classroom in a box units that we actually send to emerging economies. Now, what's interesting with COVID, and Eric mentioned, we've been at this since 2020 with the streaming media virtual events. We found a huge need in the States as well, in rural communities. So we're also looking at those models of, as we collect that old gear, refurbishing some of it and putting it out into communities that really just don't have the connectivity that you and I are so used to having. So that's a short synopsis, Eric.
Perfect. I will pop the URL for the Help Me Stream Research Foundation into the chat if you want to find out more about it. So, but now I'll pass things over to you and let you introduce our panelists to talk about cloud versus on-prem versus hybrid, Tim.
Sounds great. So let's start first with Bill, since Signiant is the sponsor. Bill, introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about Signiant, and then I've got the first question for you.
Great. I'm Bill Thompson. I'm director of our SaaS platform here at Signiant. And most people in the M&E space are familiar with Signiant for our ability to move large files fast. We're in the middle of many, many workflows, both on-prem to cloud, cloud to cloud. And yeah, that's what we do.
Okay. And what's the, you said most companies in the M&E space know you. What's sort of the biggest challenge that companies have as they try to make a decision to move off, say, old technologies like FTP to acceleration solutions like yours?
These days, the decisions get easier and easier for them because, as you know, with the growth of resolution in pictures and file sizes, anything that was, just barely getting them by a couple of years ago doesn't really cut the mustard anymore.
Sure.
So, that's an ongoing challenge. I think a greater challenge, though, is as workflows get more diverse and more distributed, tracking where your content is and finding it is a greater and greater challenge that I think small companies and large companies all share.
Good. All right. Thank you very much. Renard, we'll move to you next. If you'll just introduce yourself briefly, and then I've got a quick question for you.
Hi, my name is Renard Jenkins. I work for Warner Brothers, WarnerMedia. I am the Senior Vice President of Production Integration and Creative Technology Services. We focus on making sure that we can help dreams come true for all of our customers, our producers, and our directors and so forth. That's our main goal, is integrating creative and emerging technology into production and helping it move through things. So that's pretty much what I do.
Nice. So I have a motion picture background and worked in film until I got tired of cutting things and having it drop on the floor and finding 2 frames. So I moved to digital solutions probably 25 years ago. You were mentioning before the call, though, that Ted Lasso has sort of single-handedly helped the move toward digital dailies. Is that something that the technology's been around for a while and people have just been loath to use it, or is it something that the technology is just now coming into play?
I think the tech has gotten to the point where it is actually usable. It's been around for a while, but the workflows around it weren't quite solid enough.
Okay.
So I think that's really where the real big push has been, that the workflows are solid and that you're able to actually do this in a manner that doesn't, freak people out. Because the truth is, that's your currency that you're playing around with, and you want your currency to be delivered in a manner that it can be secure, because that's a huge thing for us, is content protection. But you just don't want it to be secure. You want it to get there fast. You want to get there in the manner in which it was intended, and you also want to have the ability to have some feedback and to speed up that process and find efficient ways to work within that space.
Okay, good. Thank you. And so moving sort of on up the production stack, Ben, we'll go to you next. Of course, CNN being part of the same conglomerate that WarnerMedia is part of. And it was fun before the call to, just like when we've all worked in big companies, you find people in different divisions that you've heard about. You and Renard obviously are going to have a lot to talk about after this. But the question for you, sort of, so you sent some notes that talked about the fact that rack space in Midtown Manhattan is really expensive, and where REMI has come into play. How do we balance those things between having sort of a data center that we as a company own, or a conglomerate own, versus sort of relying on third-party cloud solutions?
I think that's kind of on a per project basis. Some things are just going to work better in the cloud and some things aren't, especially older things that have all of the inertia and all of the expertise of on-prem or more hybrid. they're just not going to be ready to do stuff in the cloud, and that's why you need these spaces for those. But for us in the digital space, I'm particularly working with CNN Digital. It just makes more sense. The things we need to do, not needing to have giant, Mac towers or PC towers to edit, or full racks for control room stuff. I'm working literally in a reclaimed phone booth that I stole as my control room right now, which you just couldn't do if I needed to have 3 giant racks in here. So I really think that's on a per project basis for what makes the most sense.
And that leads to so many Doctor Who jokes about it being bigger on the inside, but we'll skip those for the moment. So speaking of skipping across the pond to Loke at TV2, and Loke, you work more on the delivery side than the rest of the, I guess the rest of the panelists. What are the big challenges that you face from that standpoint?
Well, on the distribution side, of course, there is the scaling the delivery to a number of clients that are watching streams. That's a big part of what we do. The other part is that we get a lot of content that's not necessarily produced in-house. Oftentimes, we will get licensed catalogs of content, and basically having to ingest 10,000 hours of content that nobody planned for because there wasn't a plan until somebody decided to license that content. And that impacts also whether we want to go to a cloud or on-premise solution, because sometimes if you need to do that at a very short time frame, it can be challenging to do that with on-premise stuff, just because you have to source hardware and get it installed. And especially at the current time we're living in, sourcing hardware and getting there on time is not necessarily an easy job. And that's also what we sort of think about, and has pushed us more towards the cloud environment where we can just pay to have, in practice, unlimited capacity.
Okay, so a couple weeks ago we released a survey. Eric was part of this, myself, and another company in the space around secure streaming and broadcast workflows. And one of the things that came out of that was a series of comments from people who had taken the survey. And Loke, I wanted to touch on one with you. One of the comments was that their company didn't need to use the cloud because they had enough computing power and storage for their projections. You just mentioned those scenarios where, I got 100 hours of content that suddenly I need to either have MES files for and multiple formats or what have you. So you had some good insight into that. Just give us a little bit of that insight.
Yeah, so I think in a lot of cases, the way those companies work is if they have stuff on premise, they'll buy something and then they'll basically assume that runs forever. There's no really plan to upgrade the capacity of that or capabilities of that. And that can work great for some things. But for other scenarios where you have these things that are short notice and needs a lot of scale, it can be kind of tricky to go with that, because then you're sort of exceeding the capacity on premise. You need to go out and invest in a lot of new gear. So of course, in the cloud environment, it works differently. You pay monthly for the usage, and that means that you'll continue to pay whether or not you actually, but whether or not that equipment, unlike equipment, you still have to pay every month because it's a service charge. But that also means that you can scale down and you can scale up. So if we had a large part of our catalog that we no longer needed, we could just remove that from storage and the bills would go down. And if we need this additional capacity for new content coming in, we can just pay the bills and we'll have basically unlimited capacity. And that goes for things like storage. It goes for things like encoding that we can scale up and down on demand. Depending on what your sort of workload is and how much you're able to predict, that might change whether or not you want to go for a cloud environment or on premise. I haven't been able to predict anything about what the business sites wants licensed at this point. So for us, we probably tend to go more towards the cloud just because that gives us the flexibility we need to be agile enough to handle those workloads.
Okay, got it. So Bill, speaking of the cloud, I mean, obviously you have a SaaS solution, software as a service model. You mentioned before the call that you all work in what you call multi-cloud. So give us a little bit of understanding on that. I mean, I think people are familiar on the delivery side with multi-CDN, but how does what you're doing sort of differ from the typical?
Yeah, it's really dictated by our customers, right? So it's just the clarification that, yeah, there's the cloud, but even if you're just talking about public cloud, which cloud? So about, I don't know, 1 out of every 3 of our customers has some form of cloud storage, usually along with on-prem. And AWS tends to be the #1 choice for that S3 storage.
Sure.
But we have customers who ask us, and we've delivered solutions that can go from cloud to cloud. And the reasons why our customers want that, there's a couple of different reasons. One, they may not want to be over dependent on a given vendor. I mean, that's a motivation. 2, maybe there's a pricing difference in a given service. But a really interesting one is the fact that there may be better tools or better compute instances in one cloud than there are in the others. For example, we have a customer in the UK who does most of their work in AWS when they work in the cloud. But some of their workflow, they moved to Google because I think it's because the compute instances are better suited for the rendering tasks that they need to do during production. So there's lots of reasons why, this multi-cloud is it's definitely becoming more prevalent in our space, in the markets we serve.
Okay, very good. And I'll actually mention that one of the things that I found quite interesting, we're doing a survey around different types of delivery and multiple cloud solutions. I'm going to ask Eric to post a copy of the link in the chat, but it's been fascinating to see multiple respondents to that do exactly what you're saying, Bill. They say, I use Azure and I use Google, or I use S3 instances, but I also use some other form of on-prem. So Renard, to you, when one of the big issues that people have brought up is they tend to not think the cloud is as secure as it can be, or as it could be if they were strictly doing on-prem or behind a firewall. You sort of have the opinion, though, that a hybrid model makes sense. And tell me where security fits in those hybrid models.
Yeah, I think the industry as a whole has gotten used to the hybrid model. It's sort of a gateway. It's a way to sort of bridge what you're doing today with what you'd like to do tomorrow. The issue that a lot of people have is that they are used to having things near them. They're used to having control over everything within their environment. And to be totally honest with you, if you have a SOC 2 instance within your organization, you've got it built up behind a number of firewalls, you have all of your security in place, you're taking a look at, CSAP and some of these other sort of recommendations for how you build that out, you probably do have the most secure place that you're ever going to have your content. But if you want to have scalability, and scalability with the ability to do it very quickly, and then, you take the cost out of the equation right now. But if you want something that you're going to be able to spin up quickly, spin down quickly, start a channel, do all these types of things that we would like to do within this space, you need to look at the cloud. Now, I believe in bridging your private cloud with your public cloud. I think that is the direction that will get people to jump on board a lot faster. So that's what I believe is going to take you there. But you have to get comfortable with the fact that there is just a buttload of security that is a part of the major cloud instances, and the major SaaS providers. That's one of the things that they provide. And the second thing that you have to really look at is that when you're inviting them into your home, you need to make sure that you vet them in the same way that you would vet something that you were building internally. And if you do that, then I think there's going to be more of a comfort level from the security standpoint. But, there are a ton of wonderful recommendations for how you keep your content secure that are out there in the market. The Movie Labs CSAP that they just released a few weeks ago. And full disclosure, I am on the board of Movie Labs, but I'm not just saying that because I'm on the board. It's a wonderful document, and it's a great guiding document. So if you haven't had a chance to read it, take a look at it. And I think it'll help a lot of these organizations as they continue their maturation towards the cloud.
Okay, good, thank you. And I think there's that balance too that we have in the industry between redundancy, because obviously, putting it in the cloud and keeping it on-prem, it's nice from a failover standpoint, but you're right, the security issue is a huge issue. Ben, you mentioned one of the issues that you have with the cloud is latency. Can you go into a bit of a detail there? Because I think we all do. And let me also say, you mentioned TriCaster, vMix, those kinds of things. When I used to build out corporate boardrooms for Ernst & Young and other companies, they'd say, oh, we can use the TriCaster output to do the image magnification. No, you can't, because there's a 3-frame buffer that looks.
You can, it ain't gonna be pretty.
Yeah, and if you wave here, it's going to wave here, half a second later. But when you move sort of totally to the cloud, latencies do become a really big deal.
Yeah, latency is an issue for a couple of reasons. At the very core of it, you have people in different locations, and it's that traditional, hey, it's a delay before I hear you and a delay before you hear me back. So from a pure content level, that's an issue. But the other major issue I have with latency is on the control room side, which is intercom. You have not just your talent talking, but also everyone behind the scenes.
Sure.
Which means things like if you have a speaker on, everyone's going to have their speaker on at a different time, and WebRTC and any other protocol can't cancel out all of those speakers and all of those people talking at the same time. Even 2 people in the same room will be sending signals at slightly different times. I envision a world in this cloud and even a remote world, even if you're hybrid, where you have a on-prem control room but a people out in the field, you're never going to be able to use speakers ever again in a control room if you want people not to hate themselves and want to not work for you because they keep hearing echoes in the headsets. And I don't know of any legitimate way to make that work just because of how physics and internet speeds work. Just latency of people talking and hearing things at different times on different devices, I think is going to be one of the long-term problems that is going to be very, very hard to solve. Because ultra low latency isn't enough. A quarter second is way too much. Right. When you're dealing with just people talking in intercom.
Well, and I come out of a video conferencing background too. So for me, 250 milliseconds is the upper end that we could deal with. Now, it's interesting. I've heard of a lot of small productions actually just doing a conference call using an audio bridge because they have that synchronized, very, very low latency phone conversation between them. Is that just a stopgap until we can get the IP issues dealt with?
It's a stopgap because even with that, first of all, you're physically muting and unmuting, and you don't have all the things like different party lines and the ability to individually talk to people in the same way. So yeah, it'll get the job done. And during COVID, it got a lot done for a lot of people. But the fact of the matter is, it takes electrical signals a certain amount of time to get from place to place. And outside of a string and paper cups, I'm not sure if there's any magical way to get that low enough to be the true real time of a physical control room with everyone on-prem together.
That's very true. Okay, Loke, so one other question for you. The concept around people not knowing enough about the cloud or feeling like the cloud doesn't work because they've heard anecdotal evidence. You obviously advocate going to the cloud. What are some of the lessons that you learned? What are some of the pushbacks that you had to work through from that standpoint?
Well, one of the lessons is that you always want to do things in the cloud with the cloud. So to say, it's a lot of cases I've seen are people doing what's often called lift and shift, basically taking their on-premise servers and putting them in a cloud environment. Okay. And that's not going to give you what you want. That's going to be a very expensive way to run virtual servers. That's not what AWS and Azure and Google could do. You got to sort of adapt to the facilities it provides. So for instance, in our case, when we move workflows to the cloud, we also build it on the basic cloud services. So we run that in AWS. So for AWS, that's some stuff like step functions and queues and stuff, and building on those primitives in the cloud, because that allows us to actually use it way more efficiently. It allows us to not spin up servers, but just pay for the actual services that we use for individual encoding or for just batch processing of stuff. We don't have to worry about the underlying infrastructure. The cloud scales it up and scales it down once we're done processing. I think it's important to learn how each individual cloud works, because they don't necessarily work in different ways, similar to what Bill said about a lot of his customers choosing multiple different clouds because some of them are good at one thing and some of them are good at other things. So I can certainly understand that if you haven't read about it, haven't really sort of looked into how they work, it can be intimidating, and it's probably also not a good idea to just go in with that assumption and say, okay, this is just any other data center, because in reality, it's probably not. I would, of course, argue that the benefits outweigh that the initial investment in figuring out how the stuff will work for each individual cloud, or multiple clouds if that's what you end up using. But there is definitely a barrier to entry there, that is learning how to do things in a way that works best in a given cloud, because otherwise you end up just paying way more for capacity that you're not actually using. And if that's the case, then the cloud just becomes too expensive compared to an on-premise solution.
Well, and I think you bring up a really good point with different clouds doing different things. I mean, if we look back at Azure, the history was to become a platform as a service. You know, that meant essentially replicating what you would do in a Windows device, but on the cloud. EC3 instances, you know, it's or S3 instances is, you know, pretty much storage and a little bit of compute power. So when you try to marry those two things together in the way that Google approaches it and the way that some of the others, you're right, it's almost an apples to oranges comparison. So
yeah, and some of them have also clearly defined a new way of thinking about things. I mean, S3 has gotten so popular that a bunch of clouds are now providing S3 interfaces, because it turns out it's actually quite useful. Before that, for most people, it was file shares or tape storage, and that was what people were using. And now it turns out that S3 is actually, in some ways, way better for some, at least some workflows. So definitely.
Well, and it's also been surprising to me as we've done this survey and I've looked at early results, just how many people still sort of rely on SneakerNet. You know, and you're right, that model worked, but to Renard's point about security, you get a FedEx that gets lost and all of a sudden your dailies, you know, are sitting in somebody's hand, and they'll take the time to figure out how to decrypt it if they can. So Bill, speaking of security, there was a question from the audience that said, you know, when we look at these multi-cloud solutions, is the integration point between those vulnerable from a security standpoint? And if so, how to mitigate that?
Well, in our case, we're kind of the integration point, but let's be clear. All of the Signiant solutions will move people's content from their S3 bucket to their file storage or to another cloud. So it's always starting and ending in their own storage. And of course, our solutions, among other things, are responsible for providing the instructions to move the file and then move the file. But all during that time, you know, it's fully encrypted. We can't open the file. So we feel pretty good about providing a solid, secure place where we handle their files. And, you know, we use well-recognized third-party security firms that audit every release, every SaaS release we do. They open it up and do all sorts of crazy testing on it. So, you know, we've been recognized by DPP and others for our attention to detail on the security side. It's no doubt you have to have a strong security pedigree. We happen to use the same security firm as the Disney organization does. So we feel pretty good about that. But, you know, we spend a lot of money and a lot of effort on security. There's no getting around it.
So I would assume both the content at rest is secure and encrypted, as well as the transport itself.
Well, again, we'll move content into customers' owned storage.
Okay.
And what they do with it, there is
their decision.
What they do with it. But you're right. I mean, that would be a safe assumption. It is encrypted.
Okay. All right. Very good. So Renard, you laughed when I said SneakerNet. Is this what the digital dailies essentially are replacing from your standpoint?
But I wouldn't call it SneakerNet. It's a much more sophisticated process than SneakerNet. But the movement of physical assets,
Right.
where you can actually minimize that, that's what we're looking to do.
Okay, yeah. And I say SneakerNet because I remember the old days when I had a Micronet 1 gig drive on my Media 100, and I would jerk that puppy out, run it down the hall because I was working in a DoD facility and we couldn't transport it across the network. And then
I remember carrying drives in plastic shoe boxes so that you didn't create static when you were actually
static on it. Yeah. What were you saying, Ben? Were you the one saying that?
Oh, I was just saying that you're all incredibly old.
Yeah, but you know what? We know what the convenience is that we get now versus that before. Okay, so let's see. We have another quick question from the audience. Somebody said, what are resources to kind of help bridge the quote old school or just old like me on-prem solutions to cloud workflows, or is it just adding extra overhead in terms of capacity of your connectivity, bumping up the amount of data pipe you have coming into a facility? And I'll open that up to anybody on the panel.
Well, I think I would just say there are plenty of vendors who do a good job in this space. There's a lot of canned solutions that you can use as templates for getting your workflows built, things like AWS to Media or others. So, that's a good place to start.
Okay.
I think part of the question also referred to, like, do I need additional developers to handle this, or can I basically run my servers in the cloud? And I think the question is definitely you need additional developers, and that will present an overhead of having those additional developers. But it also means that if you have workflows that scale up and down a lot, if you set it up right, when they scale down, you'll pay almost nothing. And then, of course, when you scale up, you'll pay for it. But usually, when you need to scale up, it means that you have some revenue on the other end attached to that. So that might be more acceptable than having to pay for something all the time that you might not use. So I would, in most circumstances, at least say hire the developers and do that instead of just running the same workflows that you do on premise and virtual machines.
Yeah, Loki makes a great point that, when you think about this, or you think about getting into this space, you do have to think about the personnel that you have, currently in your facility. There is going to be, sort of a ramp up time. There has to be training for those engineers that are in place today. And then you do have to do exactly what Loki said. You've got to enhance that group with the proper personnel to actually help you bridge that gap that you're asking about. The other part of this is that, yes, when you talk about, do I need to make sure that I have good bandwidth? Of course, yes, that's a yes without even thinking about it. You got to make sure that you've got a really good, robust setup coming in and out of your facility. If you don't, then what's the use in doing this? Because you're not going to save time. You're not going to get any efficiency if it's going to take you, twice the amount of time to upload it than it could, coming directly out of a machine to something on-prem. So yes, you have to actually think these things through. And then you also have to look at your workflows, as Loki mentioned earlier. You have to redesign your workflows in order for them to be efficient in this space. You cannot do the lift and shift. Anybody who's going to do the lift and shift is going to be ultimately very unhappy with what they're going to get. And now there are, in my world, there are certain VFX software and applications and things like that do not actually allow you to use virtualized machines or to be able to use the cloud. So there are other things that you have to actually start to work on in order to make that happen. And those are things that we're now trying to develop along with a lot of our partners.
Okay, interesting. So speaking of sort of redefining workflows, Ben, you mentioned something interesting. It was the sort of tactile devices you're used to in a control room versus having a mouse or a trackpad. And I'm going to mention something old school again. I worked in early Pro Tools Digidesign systems where we didn't really have mixing surfaces. And somebody donated a Digi 002, which is sitting back here, which I love because it was the 8 flying faders, and I was able to teach kids in school you only have 8 fingers really to work with, so 8 is enough, and you can just roll yourself through the next batch of 8, etc. But talk about how during the pandemic, as you're dealing with this stuff from home or not sitting in the control room, has it been difficult to deal with it with just mouse clicks and trackpads?
So mouse clicks and trackpads suck, because think about those 8 fingers you have, you're down to 1 fat dumb finger. So I'm really anti that. At the very least, keyboard tracking to like make different keys in your keyboard do things. From the prosumer world, and particularly the gamer world, the kind of the lifeline to live production for me has been Stream Deck. They're basically I have literally my giant array of Stream Decks that are currently off, because the laptop I use to run this is the one I'm using for this call. But the ability to map anything to a key and basically build out my own switcher, but just the keys that I need from it, has been an absolute godsend. I personally use software called Central Control to connect that to the cloud, which also lets you connect other things. So I have like my Behringer X Touch, all these different kind of MIDI or third-party ways to get, just keyboard entry. And I don't, there you go.
I'll show it in a minute, but basically for anybody who doesn't know, this is what an interface looks like when you're trying to go new school as opposed to old school.
Yeah, and the reality is, coming especially from this prosumer background, you don't need giant switchers. Now, like we're doing a lot of work with Grass Valley Amp, and I'm excited to get our K-frame in here that just basically is a remote control to the cloud K-frame that we're using. But we just understand I could do this entire show with maybe 50 buttons, and when they're compressed into this small thing, it just works. Like, yeah, I might not have that perfect T-bar, or I might not have that perfect audio fader all the time, but it gets the job done. And for the end user, the audience, if they don't know and it works easier for us and I could keep those on my desk in my kitchen, great.
So for those younger coming up who are used to gaming, using basic controllers and like that, those obviously could be assigned functions as well. Do we see a move towards repurposing gaming tactile, interfaces?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for like a PTZ, a pan tilt zoom thing for your camera, use an Xbox controller. I mean, all of these different methods that gamers use. I mean, what is a video game except a virtual camera that's floating around, or things within a virtual environment? I mean, all of that is super duper relevant now. Gaming is in many ways at the forefront of a lot of cloud production, especially with latency and communications. I mean, they're a multi-billion-dollar industry, and they're spending multi-billion dollars on the production environments to get this all done. And most of us probably don't even think or know about that it exists, but it's all there. I mean, they were the ones who, with like OBS, and they were the first people to put that into like Amazon and cloud environments. They've been doing this for longer than a lot of us have.
And I'll throw out a quick kudos to Tarek and some of the guys at Twitch who I've interviewed before, just to understand how they're dealing at scale. Corey with Blizzard and like that as well. So here's a question from the audience that I'm going to throw out to everybody. Somebody says, look, if I've got 10,000 viewers in one building, on-prem seems to be the only sensible distribution solution. Otherwise, there's far too much public internet bandwidth consumed. Multicast obviously can handle parts of that, and some of the old protocols like RTMFP would essentially do peer-to-peer. Loki, from a delivery standpoint, I guess I'll start with you on this question. What would your advice be to somebody who's dealing with, say, a corporate network where they have content coming into in through the firewall that needs to be distributed to a massive number of people on the corporate network?
Sure. So, I mean, in that case, it makes sense to maybe have it on premise for sure, because otherwise you're going to need 10,000 times distribution into your network. I think multicast is certainly an interesting aspect of that could be very useful, but it also depends on which clients are you actually going to use to view this. A bunch of clients, you don't necessarily have the option of doing multicast, receiving the streams. Smart TVs is a classic example of something where you're fairly limited in what you can do. Often browsers wouldn't want to do UDP and multicast and stuff like that either, at least not until we see WebRTC now coming out as a standard. Another way that I've seen also happen in ISP networks is having a bunch of HTTP caches, standard HTTP web caches in your network, placed at strategic points, and then using those as basically an in-house CDN to deliver that. I've done that with ISPs before in order for them to distribute live streams in a way that works with normal streaming that we use on the web today. And that works surprisingly well and can get you pretty close to what multicast gives you. Of course, you'll still have a lot of extra bandwidth used at the endpoints, but you can actually place it somewhere in your core network, places where it makes sense for that in-house delivery.
Okay, got it. So Bill, one of the topics you mentioned was not being sort of beholden to a single vendor. And obviously people who've done single cloud, we've all seen horror stories over the last year or so where you get major cloud providers going down. Is there a benefit in multi-cloud with the approach that you all are taking to actually get away from sort of a single vendor potential pitfall?
Well, I don't think people are really using multi-cloud to do failover because, as one of our other panelists mentioned, a lot of what you do in one cloud is slightly different from doing it in another cloud. So the development work is, I wouldn't say it's ×2, but they're substantially different. How do you test two different variations of services and all that? But I think what people definitely do is within a single cloud, definitely do multi-region implementations, so that if US East goes down in AWS as it did in early December, our backend, our cloud control plane fails over to US West, right? It would be it'd be an even, AWS doesn't have a lot of outages, so they're pretty rare, but it would be even a rarer day if like the East Coast and the West Coast goes down at the same time. So I don't think DR or, failover is the motivation behind multi-cloud. The clouds themselves are still too different. They're not exactly the same. So you'd be spending a lot of development time for features that you hope never are used, right?
Okay, fair point. So Renard, we've talked about multi-cloud, and one of the things you brought up was interop, and I think that's huge. It was huge when I worked in video conferencing, where we're trying to have multiple vendors work together. Ultimately, we standardized on MCUs. The CDN space seems to have standardized on sort of multi protocol messaging, on the understanding that each one of them can't get to the scale that all of them can together. Where does the cloud space sort of stand in that?
To be honest, I don't think they stand anywhere right now. The clouds, each one of them are proprietary. They are that way for business reasons. However, I think Bill brought up something. Yes, we have designed DR solutions in hopes that we could put something in place, and having a warm spare in one cloud and having your primary in another cloud, and think about how you actually do that. But yes, you do have to build that entirely different for each one of them. I think where we're getting to right now, and I hope that we'll get there, is the ability for us to have a transactional layer, and that transactional layer between clouds that allows for standardized messaging, where you can actually send and communicate between clouds, even though you're not expecting them to act in the same way. That is where I think we need to really put our focus and put our effort and our time. Allow the clouds to be who they are, and allow people who sort of prefer one over the other to be able to work in that particular space. But if you plan to actually do something in which you're working with a larger org that may be building across clouds, you need to have some sort of messaging tool. You need to have some sort of standardized way of actually doing that work. That's what we don't have today. And I think that is what is holding us back from optimizing what we could truly do in the cloud space.
Okay, fair point. That's a really, really good point. So we've talked a lot about a sort of file-based assets and moving content, but we have a question now from the audience. And again, I'll throw this out to anybody on the panel. Do we see hybrid workflows where a live feed's delivered from a broadcaster via IP or satellite to a hardware decoder, but the processing is done in the cloud? And of course, we've had several runs at that over the last couple of years. Uplink was one of those companies who did that, of course, got acquired. I think they rolled into Verizon Digital Media Services at one point, if I remember correctly. But these workflows where the broadcaster has their sort of traditional broadcast workflow, but they also want to get it to the cloud for delivery, and the transcoding essentially would be done in the cloud off of a H.264 across the MPEG-2 transport stream or something like that. Where are the models there for live, and does it add additional latency? Because I know one of the concerns people have is I have to push it up to the cloud. It's going to add latency there to do it and then bring it down, especially for live events that are critical, like sports or the Eurovision finals, that kind of Eurovision song finals.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that crazy nowadays. I mean, if you could at the very least get like an SRT signal out, which is, you know, sub-second on that, you're pretty damn close already. And you know, maybe that's not fast enough for sports. Much it has to go through a couple of other processes. But the idea of getting your initial content into the cloud, I mean, think about it. People are having video, you know, video caller conversations in the cloud already. We're already pretty damn close. And yes, it's going to take not dissimilar time to do the transcoding on-prem versus on cloud for live broadcasts.
Okay, Loki, from your standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what we do actually for our OTT service, in that our team receives SDI signals coming from the broadcast world, and then we have encoders on premise that convert those to, in our case, it's AWS Media Connect, which uses 60 amongst other protocols, and sends it up to a cloud environment where we then do the additional transcode into APR sets for distribution. And one of the reasons we've done that is because at times we've needed to do multiple different transcodes of the same stream for different targeting different devices. Right. And having that flexibility is nice without having to buy additional encoders that we then end up not using, maybe because we can actually standardize it later. So that's definitely a workflow that I think makes sense depending on the scenario. And as Ben quite rightly said, it can add latency, because in our case that inserts an additional encoder than what we had before, because we need to transcode it to put it send it up to the cloud and then transcode it again for actual distribution. So there is definitely a latency penalty there, but for most cases it should be small enough that it doesn't matter when we're talking the distribution side, at least. Probably a little bit different scenario when you're getting in for mixing and stuff like that, but for distribution it makes sense for us.
I would say, yeah, for I would be much more concerned about the latency downstream from the initial cloud ingest. Like it's everyone else's problem, I'd say, for the most part.
Yeah, I think it's funny that you say that, Ben, because what you and Loki are actually describing is the same issues that we have with SDI and the head ends. You know, when you're sending your signal to the head ends for distribution through your cable. The thing that I think is very interesting is some of the work that's being done in the content fabric space, where you get away from the CDNs and you're actually looking at a blockchain-based sort of foundational structure that allows you to audit all of your transactions in time, and then actually using that for your distribution instead of using a cloud like what we have today, or internet like what we have today, which was not truly built for video. But when you start to look at some of these solutions that are out there, like a content fabric, that are truly built for video distribution, you open the door for a whole new way for us to think about this. And that makes some of the CDNs nervous, and, rightfully so. But what it also does is that it reduces the amount of latency because of the way that the architecture is actually built for all of this to actually be in a single place, instead of us having to bring it down, transcode it, and then push it back out.
So are you saying that RTMP, which was created like 25 years ago, is not the best possible way to send video around the internet?
I am saying that emphatically, Ben.
But here's what's fascinating on the low latency panel that we did a couple of days ago with Ryan from Millicast, now Dolby. We were actually talking about the fact that when I did the Wowza market validation of what they were stating for their scale, they still were having a whole bunch of people go, yeah, okay, fine, half a second's great for latency, but I'll go ahead and, because I've got RTMP in my workflow, I'll take that extra half second hit, just give it to me, connected into OBS or something like that, and I'm good to go. I also will say too, and we're on Zoom, so I can mention this, Zoom uses scalable video coding, which essentially takes the highest possible content data rate possible, and then strips out segments of it to get you down to those lower bandwidths. So you can have people on different bandwidths on the same call, each receiving the best possible that they can. That's actually a model that's also being played with in the WebRTC space because of the scalability issues for distribution. So Renard, I like your idea. I also think it's surprising how those old protocols may rear their heads again to live a longer life, as much as we don't want them to.
Yeah, and I will say that first of all, it is not my idea. This is something that's out in the industry right now, so I take credit for it. I just study and really take a look at my research and development as to which direction I think is going to work best for what we do. Sure. But I agree with you. I think that we are going to see some legs in some of those old protocols. I mean, look, let's be real. SDI has been around forever. Yeah. It hasn't gone anywhere yet. You know why? Because it works. So if something works, there's no reason to throw it out. You have to figure out how can you integrate it in to what else you're doing until you get to the point where it no longer is of value to you. And then you come up with something new.
Blockchain SDI. Let's do it.
I was just describe it to your class 1 engineer as being, no, this is SDI across twisted pair as opposed to SDI across, a coax cable and like that. Mm-hmm. All right. Mm-hmm. So speaking of that, let's also talk briefly about ad insertion, because this was one of the things in the low latency panel where we were talking about WebRTC being not ultra low latency in terms of video conferencing, but lower latency than streaming, and the problem they have with inserting targeted ads into those solutions. Renard, you mentioned live content distribution via HLS with targeted ad insertion and data. Just let's talk about that briefly across the panel. I'll start with you.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you go back to your old school way of thinking, you've got your Hank and your bank data that actually travels with your signal, and that's how you're actually doing a lot of that work. Now we're starting to look at 224 as a possibility for us to actually add within your HLS stream in order to be able to do, sort of targeted ads. But the real thing is sort of you get into that ethical conversation of, okay, how much information can we start to actually get back from a device that someone is using, so that we can actually then provide them with a targeted ad that is specifically for them. Research has shown that individuals actually have less of an aversion to ads that actually appeal to things of interest to them than they do with just ads that just pop up and run. People will actually go ahead and take something free with commercials now, as long as the commercials are applying to them. I think as we start to look at what we can do in this space, especially with the live stuff and that Loke and Ben are doing, this is where we have an opportunity to reach our consumers and our customers where they are, and then start to monetize this on the other side with our advertisers and those who actually fund a lot of the work that we do. If we can combine the two of those things, and when we are offering a better product for both groups that we actually are beholden to. That's where I think that the ability for us to be able to sort of integrate what we do today and what we have the capability of doing today, that's where they really mix. So that's what I'm interested in seeing how it actually happens. And that's why, Ben and I have a lot to talk about.
All right, I'm going to open that up to Bill, Loke, and Ben. Any other sort of thoughts around that HLS with metadata that goes through to the end user device and comes back from the end user device? And obviously, Loke, GDPR is a huge issue in Europe.
And CDPR is a huge issue for those of us in California, and BDPR in Virginia. I mean, the governance around this is huge, and we have to be careful in how we implement. But yeah, so I definitely hear you loud and clear.
We do
Go ahead.
We do live insertion across both actually Dash and HLS today with different vendors, and one of the ways that we can sort of handle some of these privacy concerns is, instead of looking at the individual user, maybe have some properties that describe the user. So let's say it's in this age bracket, it's in this location, that sort of thing. And then you target ads to those, because in reality, most of the ad purchasing isn't targeted on individual users. It's targeted on specific groups of people that they want to hit. So instead of looking at a specific user, look at these. Okay, this is a person that's between 20 and 25. They're living in this area and so on, and you can target that, and you can target that just fine. And then that avoids at least some of the privacy implications. I'm sure you also covered this in the low latency thing. But another thing about ad insertion and when we're doing ad replacement, which is what we do on our live streams, is that has to introduce latency, because the ad replacement service has to have time to decision those ads and replace them in the stream. So it's really, really hard to do that without adding at least some latency for that service to do its work. And that's
what's fascinating, Loki, is the argument in the WebRTC space right now is do client-side ad insertion. And it's like, are we back to that? But the answer is yes, we're thinking about going back to that on WebRTC. I don't like it. Anyway, Ben, you were going to say something, then I want to give Bill the final word since he's.
Yeah, well, it's not specifically about ad insertion. I do a lot of interactive video. The show I'm working at CNN Plus is specifically about interaction, live interaction. And we have a lot of these same kind of timing issues, and how do we make sure that things are being served to people at the right time and getting that information back from them. So there are people that do things that kind of work, but no one has like the perfect system, or at least that I've seen so far, for any of that kind of clickability. And then Apple makes everything sad by not letting us have interaction on our videos.
Got it. Okay, good deal.
And my only thought on it is, yeah, you can deliver it to via HLS or some of these other more modern formats. We support that. But I can only imagine if you switch this back to client-side ad insertion, trying to support the volume of end user devices out there and what that's going to do to, oh, well, if you're using this Apple device or this Android device, you either can or cannot get this and that. It's a complex world, right? And
I say I don't like it, and I realize from a consulting standpoint, I did a decent amount of bank working on Flash Player for mobile with all the different variabilities. So maybe it isn't so bad from that standpoint. So, all right. Well, I know we're at the end of the session, and Eric has asked me to wrap up here because he's got to do the play out of the 2 Diamond sponsors. But I'd like to thank each of you for being on the panel. Bill, thank you very much for sponsoring the panel.
Thanks for the invitation.
Renard, thank you for being on the panel. Ben, you and Renard have lots to talk about. You can do that offline. And Loke, thank you for always providing the European perspective.
Thanks.
And thank you, Tim, for doing such a great job moderating as usual. Thanks to our audience for all the great questions. The winner of the Amazon gift card is Rachel Clifton. Rachel, keep your eye out on your email for information about that. And thanks, as Tim said, to Signiant for sponsoring this, and to Bird Dog, Harmonic for sponsoring the whole week. Join us in about 30 minutes when we'll hear from Jeff Keithley about a very cool new platform as a service called Master Control Cloud. We'll see you then.